The La Crosse Public Library Archives presents Dark La Crosse Stories, a series in collaboration with the La Crosse Tribune, featuring the seedier side of La Crosse, Wisconsin's history. These true stories are reflections of their time and place in history. The intent is not to diminish the human suffering that may have resulted from these events, but to bring light to ways in which people in the past experienced life. The city of La Crosse and the locations where these stories took place occupy part of a vast network of the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk, and we thank our Ho-Chunk community members and their ancestors for their stewardship of this area's land and history.
Beautiful lady equestrians, daring acrobats, exotic animals, trained pigs, intricately carved wagons, oddities, and more. There was no better entertainment in the late 1800s than a circus. La Crosse hosted many of the circus greats over the years, including the Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey, and Buffalo Bill, among others. In 1875, two shows were scheduled to perform in La Crosse: Howe's Great London Circus in July, and P.T. Barnum in August. Both circuses took out ads in the local papers and plastered the town in posters. Often, when two shows were scheduled to perform in the same town, a bit of competition would arise. Bill posters from one show would paste their advertisements over the competitors, only to be covered the next week by the first show, and on until the shows performed. Less reputable outfits might take out an ad in the paper, announcing that their competitor had canceled their show. Barnum's ads, in reference to Howe's Great London Circus's visit in July, encouraged patrons to save their money for his show later in the summer. The day had been very warm, and Howe's Great London Circus had given its afternoon exhibition, to the great satisfaction of the general public, and the evening performance was looked forward to with pleasant anticipation. Needless to say, given the sensationalism regularly employed by newspapers in the late 19th century, there are conflicting stories as to what really happened the evening of July 24, 1875.
The show didn't begin until nearly 8:30. Over 2,000 people were in attendance and becoming quite restless.
We were watching the skies to the west, black with ominous storm clouds. The boss wasn't sure if we should start the show, but by 8:30 there was no rain, so he blew the whistle.
About 30 minutes into the show, a strong gust of wind hit the tent. I found myself quite startled.
The thunder and lightning drew closer. Sure enough, about a third of the way into the show, the storm cloud burst open over the tent.
We all looked to the proprietors and managers of the show for assurance, but without one word to the audience, or even giving a reason for their cowardly conduct, they shouted in stentorian voices, "Let down the tent! Cut the lights!" Then all the circus employees ran pell-mell into the ring and began shouting and cutting the ropes holding up the roof of the immense pavilion.
It was the most ridiculous scene I've ever witnessed, all on account of a little wind and rain. The audience rushed for the exits, ladies fainting and being trampled, hats and coats dropped on the way. I swear, I even saw a mother fling her baby to the side in her panic to escape.
I don't know any mother who would do such a thing. But all this panic could have been avoided if only the manager had stepped into the ring when he saw the storm was near and said, "Keep your seats, we are used to storms. It is our custom to lower the roof and let the lights down to the ground. As soon as the storm is over, we will proceed with the show."
Anyone smart enough to understand storms knows that sitting under a giant tent with poles reaching far into the sky is not a good idea. Of course, we had to lower the roof and the lights. The audience could have stayed put. We only had to lower the tent a bit.
Why, poor Mr. Flynn was struck on the head by one of those falling poles and never again opened his eyes. A gasoline chandelier came crashing to the ground and nearly started the whole place on fire.
How else are we supposed to get the chandelier down? We put the fire out quick enough. Shame about that old man, though.
I heard someone shout that the animals were loose. Well, this caused even more panic. Families were running the opposite direction of their homes, fighting the driving rain from one direction and the deadly animals from the other.
Weren't no animals loose running around, though I did see a man take shelter under one of the elephants. Must have thought she was a wagon. A big bolt of lightning showed him the truth, and he ran faster than I'd ever seen a man run.
Mr. John Mahoney said he sought shelter under one of the wagons, but when the sky lit up with lightning, he saw it was an elephant. The elephant must have been startled by the lightning because it threw John 40 feet away. Some patrons were caught under the tent when it fell. I can only imagine the horror of being trapped under that behemoth.
The smart ones found shelter under the lowered tent and the stands, keeping themselves dry and out of the way of the panicked crowd. The storm ended rather quickly, and these folks merely had to find their way home in the dark. The panicked ones ended up wandering back to the lot, collecting items and children they'd left behind. One woman came up to me in a panic, searching for her son, pleading with me to find her little boy. Of course I helped her look for a bit, calling out his name. Finally she shouts, "I found him." This wasn't a child at all, but a big strapping fellow about 25 or 30 years old.
I saw one of the clowns fleeing the tent, heading toward the train depot. What a coward to abandon his fellow circus men and all the helpless audience, thinking only of his own safety.
Lefty's always been a coward.
Mrs. Jones told me one of the riding ladies burst into their house naked. It seems the young woman was changing for her next act when the dressing tent blew down. Of course, Mrs. Jones gave her some clothes and some privacy to dress herself.
Ha! I bet that was a sight to see.
There are many other incidents among the circus men and women as ludicrous as these, but I don't care to contribute to the gossip by repeating them. I should have heeded the advice of Mr. P.T. Barnum and waited to spend my money on his show coming in August.
The next morning, the tents, performers, animals, and wagons were gone. The hats and shawls and coats were retrieved. All that remained of the evening's events were some stray popcorn boxes and lemonade cups. Barnum's show in August was a hippodrome, which featured a variety of horse and chariot races. He drew a large crowd, primarily from the more affluent community. Those who prefer clowns and dancing girls were disappointed. It seems 1875 wasn't a great year for circuses in La Crosse. And now I'd like to welcome in Kristen Nyholm, academic advisor at Viterbo University and board member of the Mississippi Valley Writers Guild, who wrote the story you just heard, to share a bit more.
Since 1847, Wisconsin has been home to dozens of circuses. According to one source, at least 78 circuses originated in our great state. So you can imagine that archives are full of stories. There was no shortage of tragedy around the circus, with storms, train wrecks, fires, floods, and fatal accidents. However, there were some rather humorous occurrences as well. A 1949 article in the La Crosse Tribune states that Howe's Great London Circus was a hapless outfit, always in some kind of trouble. The article goes on to explain a particular situation that occurred while some of the show's workers were gambling. This was quite a common way to pass the time while traveling. Having run out of money, one player laid his revolver on the table to cover a bet. Eddie, the man featured in this article, picked up the revolver to examine it and fired straight through a partition into the treasurer's office at the other end of the train car. Eddie was sure he'd killed the treasurer and ran to the office, only to find him calmly engaged with his records and unperturbed. "You're alive, Jess?" ranted Eddie. "Must be," replied Jess. The bullet passed within an inch of the treasurer's head, but he hardly looked up as he said, "Think nothing of it, Eddie. Anything can happen with this damn show." Sometimes the circus workers, or roustabouts, would entrust their money to one of the bosses with the show to keep them from gambling or drinking it away. Robert H. Gollmer wrote about one such incident in his book, My Father Owned a Circus. Chuck, a man of color, was a roustabout on the Gollmer Brothers show and gave his money to Emery Stiles, the head animal boss. Chuck's job kept him from seeing the show until late in the summer. One day, he happened to catch Emery's elephant act and saw the man laying under the elephant, about to be crushed. Of course, this was part of the act, but Chuck demanded his money from Emery after the show. Chuck is quoted, "Someday that big elephant's gonna scrunch down just a little bit further. Who's gonna believe this old colored man left his money with Mr. Stiles?" Emery turned over the money, a whole $6, without a word. Gollmer had quite a few stories about elephants in his book about the circus his father and uncles started. In the early days of the show, the Gollmers had only one elephant, named Palm. She was great friends with the 4 Shetland ponies on the show, and often plodded along behind them from town to town. One night, the wagon train was stopped for a while because the bridge had washed out. Palm wandered to the oat field next to the road and began to have a little snack. The ponies, harnessed to their wagons, protested the unfairness. Palm gathered up some oats in her trunk and laid them in front of her friends so they could enjoy a snack as well. Once they were satisfied, Palm promptly returned to her own meal. Palm found herself useful again while traveling through Illinois one dry summer. The wagons passed by a farm with a windmill filling a large tank with fresh water. The drivers asked the farmer to sell them some water for the animals, but he refused. Having none of this, Palm wandered up from her place in line. The farmer tried to shoo her away, but she picked him up with her trunk and set him aside, then continued on to the tank. The farmer was shocked into silence at first, but eventually laughed and let the drivers in. That's the biggest thrill of my life. Who would think I would get to ride in an elephant's trunk? Another story from Gulmer's book features Jessie McCart, daughter of circus owner George Popcorn Hall. She was also known as Ilma the Snake Charmer, and it's said that she had 18 pythons in her home. One day, a neighbor stopped by to visit and found Jessie sleeping on the couch. The neighbor reached out to wake Jessie up when one of the pythons sleeping with her raised its head. This gave the visitor quite a start, and she fainted, waking Jessie. The neighbor regained consciousness to find Jessie and the python leaning over her. I can only imagine her reaction. Here's hoping your work isn't interrupted by accidental bullets, an elephant doesn't pick you up in its trunk, and a snake doesn't wake you from a nap. Thanks for listening.